Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, settle into your blankets, and let the outside world just sort of fade into the background. Tonight, we're going to spend a very long, very quiet time looking at how ordinary people survived nights that, frankly, should have killed them. We're talking about the gritty, freezing, and often deeply weird ways our ancestors managed to wake up the next morning despite the universe's best efforts to the contrary. It's not a story of high-octane survival. It's a story of being very cold, very stubborn, and sometimes very lucky. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's drift back into the shivering shadows of the past. We often think of the Middle Ages as a time of knights and dragons, but for the average person, the biggest villain wasn't a dragon. It was Tuesday in January. Imagine, if you will, a peasant named Geoffrey. Geoffrey lives in a hut that is essentially a pile of sticks held together by hope and dried mud. When the sun goes down in the year 1240, it doesn't just get dark. It gets, I can't see my own hand, and also my toes are starting to regret their existence dark. Geoffrey doesn't have a thermostat. He doesn't even have a glass window. Glass was for rich people who wanted to look at their gardens. Geoffrey has a hole in the wall with a piece of oiled linen stretched over it, which does a fantastic job of letting the wind in while keeping the light out. The primary survival strategy for someone like Geoffrey was the human-animal pile. You see, the hearth in the center of the room was great, but wood was expensive, and the smoke tended to linger in the thatch roof until everyone was coughing like a Victorian orphan. So the real warmth came from the cows. Yes, the cows. Medieval houses were often longhouses, meaning the family lived at one end and the livestock lived at the other. There was no door between them, just a slight change in floor level if you were fancy. If you were a peasant trying to survive a blizzard, you didn't sleep in a bed. You slept as close to a warm, breathing, slightly flatulent ox as humanly possible. It was nature's space heater, provided you didn't mind the smell of manure and the occasional hoof to the ribs. Then there was the concept of second sleep. This is one of those historical quirks that feels entirely alien to us now. Before the light bulb ruined everything, people didn't usually sleep in an 8-hour chunk. They would go to bed at sunset, sleep for about 4 hours, and then wake up around midnight. This watch lasted an hour or two. During this time, they'd poke the fire, chat quietly, or perhaps reflect on why they decided to be peasants in the first place. Then they'd go back for a second sleep until dawn. It was a rhythmic, slow way of existing that matched the turning of the earth. It wasn't efficient, but efficiency hadn't been invented yet, which is honestly quite relaxing to think about. Moving up the social ladder didn't necessarily make the nights any warmer, though it did make them more crowded. If you were a servant in a great manor, you didn't have a room. You had a spot on the floor in the great hall. After the lord and lady had finished their dinner and retired to their private chambers, which were still drafty enough to fly a kite in, the servants would spread out their straw mats. You'd be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with 20 other people, all of whom likely had a very casual relationship with bathing. But in the dead of winter, body heat was the only currency that mattered. You'd wrap yourself in a coarse wool cloak that smelled of wet dog and old soup, and you'd just wait for morning. If you were a royal, you had the luxury of a great bed. These were massive wooden structures, often with heavy velvet curtains. These curtains weren't just for privacy or to keep the commoners from seeing the king drool. They were functional insulation. You'd climb into the bed, pull the heavy drapes shut, and create a tiny warm microclimate inside. Of course, you'd also be sharing that bed with several high-ranking advisors or family members, because being alone was considered weird and potentially dangerous. Imagine trying to get a good night's rest while the Duke of Somewhere Important is snoring 3 inches from your ear and the curtains are trapping the scent of everyone's unwashed velvet tunics. It was prestigious, certainly, but it wasn't exactly a spa day. Let's float over to a different kind of survival, the night watchman.
These were the poor souls tasked with walking the perimeter of a city or castle, while everyone else was huddled in their cow-scented huts. In places like London or Paris, the night watchman had to contend with the humors of the night air, which everyone knew was toxic. To survive a night on the beat, you needed a heavy lantern, a sturdy pike, and a very thick skin. You were essentially a human alarm system in a world where the most common alarm was fire. If a fire started in a timber-framed city at 2 a.m., the night was no longer about sleeping. It was about the frantic bucket brigade's struggle to keep the entire neighborhood from turning into a charcoal briquette. But most nights were just quiet, cold, and immensely long. In the winter months, you could be looking at 16 hours of darkness. Without books, without phones, and with limited candles, people spent an enormous amount of time just being. They told stories, they prayed, they listened to the wind whistle through the thatch. Survival wasn't a dramatic leap across a chasm. It was the slow, steady endurance of the dark. It was the ability to find comfort in a heavy wool blanket and the steady breathing of a nearby sheep. It was a world that moved at the speed of a flickering candle, and tonight we're going to stay in that slow, quiet rhythm as long as it takes for the sun to come up. Chapter 2. The Frost Fairs and Frozen Rivers. The Little Ice Age was a particularly grumpy period of history, stretching roughly from the 14th to the 19th century, when the Northern Hemisphere decided it was finished with the whole mild autumn concept. During this time, the Thames in London would freeze so solid that you could drive a carriage across it. Naturally, because humans are incapable of seeing a life-threatening environmental disaster without trying to sell snacks on top of it, the Londoners invented frost fairs.
Imagine walking out onto the middle of a river that is usually a churning highway of trade and sewage, only now it's a sheet of ice several feet thick. People would set up entire streets of tents. There were barbers, pubs, and even printers who would sell you a souvenir card stating that you had stood upon the Thames in the year of our Lord 1600 and something. It sounds festive, but surviving a night at a frost fair involved a lot of gin and a very cavalier attitude toward the structural integrity of ice. If you were a merchant staying overnight to guard your stall, you weren't sleeping in a cozy bed. You were curled up on a wooden plank over 3 fathoms of freezing water, listening to the ice groan and pop like a giant bowl of cereal. The survival of the ordinary person during these winters was a masterpiece of layering. We think we understand layers, but we have polyester. They had wool, and more wool, and then, if they were lucky, some linen. If you were a traveler caught between towns when a freeze hit, your survival depended entirely on finding a way to stay dry. Once your wool coat got wet, it became a heavy, sodden anchor that sapped the heat from your bones. Travelers would often try to find hollow ways, ancient paths worn deep into the earth by centuries of use, to get out of the wind. They would bury themselves in dry leaves or straw, mimicking the behavior of forest animals. It wasn't dignified, but being dignified is a luxury for people who aren't currently turning into a human popsicle. Back in the cities, the nights were a different kind of challenge. Coal became the savior and the silent killer of the urban poor. In the 1700s, as wood became scarcer, people turned to sea coal. It was cheap, it stayed hot, and it produced a yellow, acrid smoke that could peel the paint off a fence. To survive a freezing night in a London tenement, you'd cram as many people as possible into a single room and light a small coal fire. The problem, of course, was ventilation. If you closed the door to keep the warmth in, you risked carbon monoxide poisoning. If you opened it, you froze. It was a nightly gamble between waking up with a headache or not waking up at all. Let's consider the sailors of the era, the men who spent their nights on the high seas during the height of these winters. A sailor's watch was a brutal cycle of 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Sleeping in a hammock sounds charming until you realize the hammock is damp, the air is freezing, and you are surrounded by 80 other men who have been eating salted beef and hardtack for 3 months.
The hammocks were strung so close together that they would bump into each other as the ship rolled. This man sandwich approach was actually a survival tactic. The combined body heat of the crew kept the lower decks from reaching terminal frost levels. To survive, you simply didn't think about the fact that your bed was essentially a swinging sack of misery. Further north, in places like Scandinavia or the Scottish Highlands, survival took on a more architectural form. The Black House of the Hebrides was a low, stone-walled structure with a roof of turf and straw. There was no chimney, just a hole in the roof. The smoke from the peat fire would rise, saturate the thatch, and then slowly filter out. This kept the roof dry and provided a layer of insulation that would make a modern engineer weep with confusion. On a night that should have killed them, a Highland family would sit around the central peat fire, the smoke keeping the midges and the frost at bay, telling stories in Gaelic that were older than the stones of their house. They survived by becoming part of the landscape, tucking themselves into the earth like hibernating badgers. There's a certain irony in the way we view these struggles now. We see them as extreme, but for the people living them, it was just Tuesday. They didn't have the luxury of existential dread about the cold. They just had the immediate necessity of finding more dry peat or moving the goat closer to the bed. It was a life lived in increments of warmth. Every night was a small victory won against the elements with nothing more than a bit of wool, a bit of fire, and a lot of patience. Chapter 3. The Perils of the Carriage and the Post Road. Moving into the 18th century, we find a world that was becoming increasingly mobile, which was a terrible mistake for anyone who enjoyed being warm or alive. This was the era of the stagecoach, a vehicle that looked like a very expensive jewelry box on wheels, but possessed the suspension of a falling brick. To survive a night journey in an 18th century carriage was to engage in a slow-motion battle with physics and the elements. If you were a passenger of means, you sat inside the coach, which sounds lovely until you realize the windows were often just leather flaps and the floor was covered in damp straw to soak up the mud from everyone's boots. But if you were a passenger of limited means, you sat on the roof, outside, in the wind, at 2 a.m. These people were essentially human hood ornaments, clinging to iron rails while the coach lurched over potholes that could swallow a small dog. To survive a night that should have killed them, these outsides, as they were called, would wrap themselves in several layers of drab, a heavy felted wool that was nearly waterproof because it was so thick and greasy. They would often drink a concoction called pearl, bitter beer heated with ginger and ginger, that gave them a fleeting sense of warmth while arguably making their grip on the railing much less reliable. It was a common sight for a coach to arrive at a post house in the morning, only to find the passengers on top literally frozen to their seats, requiring the ostlers to gently pry them off like ice cubes from a tray. Then we have the inns. You might imagine a cozy tavern with a roaring fire and a jovial landlord, but the reality was often a survival horror light. In the 1700s, unless you were incredibly wealthy, you didn't pay for a room. You paid for a share of a bed. This meant you'd be tucked in next to 2 or 3 total strangers. It was the ultimate social gamble. You might end up next to a quiet clergyman, or you might find yourself sharing a pillow with a soldier who had a very active case of the itch and a tendency to thrash in his sleep. The survival tactic was simple. Keep your boots under your head so no one could steal them, and wrap your coat around your torso to create a barrier between you and the questionable hygiene of your bedfellows. It was a night spent in a state of semi-vigilance, drifting in and out of a thin sleep as the fire in the common room slowly died down to white ash. Let's consider the concept of the night walker in the growing cities. By the late 18th century, London and Paris were becoming urban jungles where the night didn't belong to the law, it belonged to the shadows. For an ordinary person caught out late, survival was about blending in. There was a peculiar etiquette to walking the streets at night. You carried a link boy, a child with a torch to light your way, not because you were afraid of the dark, but because the streets were literally full of open sewers and holes. One wrong step and you weren't just cold, you were waist deep in the city's collective waste, which is a very efficient way to catch something that will kill you by Thursday.
For the truly destitute, those who couldn't even afford a shared bed in a flea-ridden inn, there was the four-penny lean. This was a peculiar institution in Victorian-era slums, though it had roots much earlier. For 4 pence, you didn't get a bed, you didn't even get a floor. You got a spot on a bench, and a rope was tied across the room in front of you. You would lean over the rope and sleep hanging like a piece of laundry. At dawn, the proprietor would simply untie the rope, and everyone would fall to the floor, the world's most efficient and least pleasant alarm clock. It was a miserable way to spend a night, but it kept you off the wet pavement and away from the predatory night constables who would arrest you for the crime of being homeless. Even the rich had their own weird survival rituals. The 18th century obsession with night air being poisonous meant that people would sleep with their bed curtains tightly drawn and their windows sealed with heavy drapes. They were essentially hotboxing themselves in their own carbon dioxide. They believed that the miasmas rising from the ground at night caused everything from gout to madness, so they'd wear elaborate silk nightcaps, often with ribbons to keep them from falling off, and bury themselves under 4 layers of goose-down quilts. They survived the night by creating a tiny, humid, oxygen-deprived sanctuary, waking up the next morning feeling groggy and vapid, which they then treated by drinking a mixture of brandy and eggs. Because why not double down on the bad decisions? As we move through these nights, we see a reoccurring theme. Survival wasn't about being a hero. It was about the clever, often gross, and always inconvenient ways humans found to keep their internal temperature just high enough to see the sunrise. It was a world of damp wool, shared breath, and the constant low-level thrum of physical discomfort that we've spent the last century trying to forget ever existed. Chapter 4: The Victorian Sick Room and the Gaslight Glow. As the 1800s rolled in, the night didn't necessarily get safer, it just got weirder. This was the era where science and superstition had a very long, very awkward dinner party. To survive a night in a Victorian city, you had to contend with a new and exciting way to accidentally perish: gaslighting. While the rich were installing ornate brass fixtures that hummed with a ghostly blue flame, the average person was living in a world of leaking pipes and heavy air. Gas leaks were so common that people just sort of accepted a mild, perpetual headache as a personality trait. To survive the night, you had to hope your pipes didn't decide to vent into your bedroom while you were dreaming of mutton. If the flame blew out but the gas kept hissing, you weren't just sleeping, you were effectively marinating in a combustible cloud. But the real drama of the night happened in the sick room. The Victorians were obsessed with the good death, but they were even more obsessed with the lingering recovery. If you fell ill, your bedroom was transformed into a padded cell of velvet and shadows. The prevailing wisdom of the time suggested that any sudden change in temperature would be fatal, so they'd seal the chimney, shut the windows, and light a coal fire until the room reached the approximate temperature of a sourdough starter. To survive a night in a Victorian sick room was to endure a feverish, hallucinatory marathon. You'd be wrapped in layers of flannel, because flannel was the 19th century version of a magic spell, and fed nothing but beef tea, which was essentially hot water that had once been in the same room as a cow. If you were a nurse, or more likely a tired female relative, your job was to stay awake in the death watch. This wasn't as spooky as it sounds. It was mostly just incredibly boring. You'd sit in a hard-backed chair by a single candle, listening to the patients rattle and trying not to think about the fact that the wallpaper was literally coated in arsenic. Yes, the vibrant green wallpaper everyone loved, known as Scheele's green, contained high levels of copper arsenite. When the damp night air hit the walls, it reacted with the paste to release arsenic gas. So while you were sitting there trying to save your Uncle Ebenezer from a chest cold, the walls were actively trying to poison both of you. It's a miracle anyone survived the 1860s, frankly. Let's float over to the industrial workers, specifically the night shift in the new mills.
For the first time in history, the sun didn't dictate the end of the day, the steam engine did. To survive a night in a textile mill, you had to navigate a forest of unprotected leather belts and whirring iron gears in a state of near total sleep deprivation. The air was thick with fluff, tiny fibers of cotton that got into your lungs and stayed there, and the noise was a constant bone-shaking roar. Workers would often sleep on their feet, their bodies moving with the rhythm of the machines while their brains were elsewhere. To survive a night like that was a feat of physical endurance that would break a modern athlete. When they finally stumbled home at 6 a.m., they didn't go to a quiet bedroom, they went to a hotbed house. A hotbed was a survival strategy for the extremely poor. Since space was limited, a bed would be rented out in shifts. When the night shift worker got home, he'd climb into a bed that had just been vacated by a day shift worker. The sheets were still warm from the previous person's body. It's a deeply unsettling thought for us, but for a shivering laborer in Manchester, a hotbed was a luxury. It meant you didn't have to waste energy warming up your own blankets. You just slid into the residual warmth of a stranger and fell into a heavy, soot-filled sleep before the cycle started all over again. And we can't talk about surviving the Victorian night without mentioning the resurrection men. If you were a commoner who happened to die during the night, your survival, or rather the survival of your remains, depended on how well your family could guard your grave. Body snatching was a booming industry because medical schools needed subjects and weren't particularly picky about where they came from. Families would take turns sitting in the graveyard.
At night, huddled under a canvas lean-to with a shotgun and a bottle of gin, watching for the flash of a spade in the moonlight. They'd even install mort safes, heavy iron cages over the coffins. It was a final, ironic struggle, surviving the night just to make sure your ancestors stayed in the ground. As the century drew to a close, the night began to lose some of its terrors, replaced by the sterile hum of electricity and the birth of modern medicine. But for a long time, the hours between midnight and dawn remained a strange, toxic, and crowded frontier, where the goal wasn't to thrive, but simply to remain among the living when the first gray light hit the soot-stained windows. Chapter 5: The Night Soil Men and the Subterranean Survivalists. While the middle class was busy worrying about arsenic wallpaper, there was an entire population of people for whom the night was not a time for sleep, but a time for the most essential and arguably most disgusting job in human history. Let's float down into the tunnels and alleyways to meet the night soil men. Before the invention of the modern sewer system, someone had to deal with the collective output of a city like London, which by the mid-1800s was producing enough waste to fill a cathedral daily. These men only worked at night by law because the smell of their work was considered a public indecency that the daylight hours simply couldn't handle. To survive a night as a night soil man was to exist in a permanent state of olfactory trauma. You'd descend into a cesspool, basically a brick-lined hole under a house, and scoop out the contents into buckets. The danger here wasn't just the smell, it was the mephitic air. Methane and hydrogen sulfide would build up in these confined spaces. If you lowered your lantern and the flame turned blue or went out, you had about 3 seconds to get out before you suffocated or the whole hole exploded. They survived by watching their candles with more intensity than a monk watches a holy relic. It was a slow, rhythmic, and incredibly dangerous dance performed in the pitch black, all to ensure that the city didn't literally drown in its own consequences by morning. Moving slightly above ground, we find the mudlarks and toshers. While the night soil men were dealing with the cesspools, the toshers were the elite explorers of the sewers themselves. They would enter the tunnels at night when the water levels were lower, looking for tosh, metal scraps, coins, or the occasional piece of jewelry dropped down a drain. To survive a night in the sewers, a tosher had to be part navigator and part rat. The Victorian sewers were a labyrinth of crumbling brick and sudden tidal surges.
If a heavy rain started while you were 3 miles deep under Fleet Street, you were effectively a dead man. Toshers would carry a pole lantern and walk in groups of 3, because the only thing more dangerous than the rising water was the legendary sewer pigs. Of course, there weren't actually pigs living in the sewers, but the myth was so strong that even the toughest toshers would swear they heard them grunting in the dark. It was a psychological survival tactic. If you were afraid of the pigs, you stayed alert for the very real danger of the gases. Then there were the knocker-ups. If you were an ordinary person who needed to survive the night and actually get to work on time, you didn't have an alarm clock. You had a person with a long stick. The knocker-up would walk the streets at 3 or 4 a.m., tapping on the second-story windows of their clients until they saw a face or heard a shout. It was a strange, silent profession. The knocker-up lived a reversed life, surviving the night by walking miles in the cold, damp air, their only company being the occasional stray dog or a weary night watchman. They were the human gears that kept the industrial machine turning, and they did it all for a few pennies a week. Let's consider the psychological survival of the ordinary person during these nights. In a world without constant noise, the night was incredibly quiet. If you lived in a rural area, the silence was absolute. People survived this sensory deprivation through an intense culture of night lore. Every creak of a floorboard or hoot of an owl was interpreted through a lens of folklore. To survive a night that felt haunted, you used charms. You'd put a piece of iron over the door to keep out the good folk, which were actually quite terrifying, or you'd sleep with a Bible under your pillow. It wasn't just about physical survival. It was about keeping your mind from unraveling in the face of a darkness that felt much bigger than you were. Even the way people ate at night was a survival tactic. The midnight snack wasn't a trip to the fridge for a slice of cheese. It was often a posset. This was a drink made of hot milk, curdled with ale or wine, often spiced with nutmeg or ginger. It was designed to sit heavy in the stomach, providing a slow-release warmth that would carry you through the dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m., when the body's core temperature naturally drops to its lowest point. You'd sip your posset, wrap your feet in a heated brick wrapped in flannel, and pray that the sun would eventually decide to show up. As we look back on these night workers and nocturnal survivors, we see a world that was divided into those who slept and those who ensured the sleepers could wake up in a functioning world. It was a fragile, soot-covered ecosystem held together by the grit of people who didn't have the option of being afraid of the dark. They just lived in it, worked in it, and, against all odds, made it through to the next day. Chapter 6. The Polar Night and the Architecture of Sanity. As we move into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we find a group of people who didn't just survive a night, but survived a night that lasted for 6 months. The early polar explorers, men like those on the Fram or the ill-fated Endurance, faced a darkness that was psychological as much as it was physical. When the sun dips below the horizon in the Arctic or Antarctic and stays there for months, survival becomes a very slow, very repetitive game of not losing your mind. To survive a polar night, these men had to turn their ships into floating cocoons. They'd bank snow against the holes to create a natural insulation, effectively turning a wooden ship into an ice fortress. Inside, the ordinary life of a sailor was replaced by a rigid, almost monastic routine. They survived the endless dark by inventing work. They would take deep-sea soundings through holes in the ice, or spend 8 hours a day meticulously cleaning the same brass fitting. It was a battle against the polar madness that came from the lack of light and the sheer crushing silence of the ice.
The heat inside these ships was a constant struggle. They used coal-fired stoves that made the air thick with soot and carbon dioxide. To survive the night, you had to balance the risk of freezing with the risk of suffocating. Men would huddle in their bunks, which were often wet with condensation that froze into sheets of ice against the hull. They'd wear their reindeer skin furs even while sleeping, the smell of curing hides and unwashed wool becoming the permanent background scent of their lives. They survived by focusing on the small things, a single extra cracker, a game of chess played over a week, or the reading and rereading of a single battered book until the words lost all meaning. Let's float back to the civilized world, where the early 20th century was introducing a new way to survive the night air cure. Despite the Victorian fear of miasmas, a new movement in medicine suggested that the only way to survive tuberculosis, or nervous exhaustion, was to sleep entirely outdoors. This led to the creation of sleeping porches, screened-in balconies where people would drag their beds in the middle of winter. To survive a night on a sleeping porch in 1910, you used a Klondike bed. This involved layering newspapers under the mattress for insulation and pinning yourself into a series of wool sleeping bags until you were effectively a human burrito. It was believed that the freezing, oxygen-rich air would toughen the lungs. People would wake up with frost on their mustaches and a thin layer of snow on their quilts, convinced they were the picture of health. It was a bizarre, self-imposed survival challenge. You'd lie there, staring at the winter stars, shivering uncontrollably, all because a doctor in a magazine told you that indoor air was spent and toxic. It was the ultimate fake-it-till-you-make-it strategy for health, and many an ordinary person spent their nights in a state of shivering misery just to keep up with the medical fashion of the day. Meanwhile, in the growing urban centers, the night owls were evolving. The 1920s saw the rise of the all-night diner and the owl train. For the first time, an ordinary person could survive a night out in the city without needing a lantern or a pike. The electric street lamp had turned the night into a pale, humming version of the day. But this created a new problem, the death of the second sleep. As the city stayed bright, the natural rhythm of human rest was shattered. People survived this transition by consuming massive amounts of coffee and tonics that were often just sugar and grain alcohol. We see a shift here in the history of survival. It was no longer about the wolf at the door or the frost in the thatch. It was about the biological cost of progress. People were learning to survive a night that no longer felt like night. They were pushing their bodies to stay awake, to work longer, to play harder, using the glow of the vacuum tube and the hum of the city to keep the old primal fears at bay. But even then, in the quietest part of the morning, that blue hour before the first commuters, the old world would peek through. You'd see a weary waiter leaning against a brick wall, his breath misting in the air, looking very much like the night watchman of 5 centuries prior. The night, no matter how much we light it up, remains a place where the human body feels its own fragility. Whether it's an explorer in a snow-caked bunk or a clerk on a sleeping porch, the goal has always been the same: to keep the internal spark flickering until the world turns back toward the sun. Chapter 7: The Great Depression and the Hobo Jungles. As we drift into the 1930s, the night became a vast, silent ocean for millions of people who had nowhere left to go. This was the era of the Great Depression, where surviving a night that should have killed you wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was a daily requirement for the displaced. Let's float down to the hobo jungles that cropped up on the outskirts of every major rail hub. These weren't just random camps, they were masterpieces of survivalist engineering using literally nothing. To survive a night in a jungle, an ordinary person, maybe a former bank clerk or a farmhand, had to master the mulligan. This was a communal stew made of whatever everyone had scrounged that day. One guy had a withered carrot, another had a handful of stolen grain, and maybe, if they were lucky, someone had a bit of gristly meat. They'd boil it all in a rusted tin can over a fire fueled by discarded railroad ties. The creosote in the wood made the smoke thick and acrid, but it kept the mosquitoes away. They survived the night by sharing stories and jungle law, a strict code of conduct that kept the peace in a world that had otherwise forgotten them. It was a communal warmth, a way of pretending the world still made sense while they slept on beds of flattened cardboard.
Then there were the Hoovervilles, shanty towns made of packing crates, tin scraps, and old car parts. To survive a night in a Hooverville was to live in a house that was essentially a jigsaw puzzle of trash. Because why not build a wall out of an old billboard and a discarded car door? The irony was that these structures were often more windproof than the medieval huts we talked about earlier, but they were twice as depressing. People would wrap their feet in Hoover blankets, which were actually just newspapers, and huddled together for warmth. They survived not through heat, but through a quiet, desperate stubbornness. They were the ghosts of the American dream, haunting the edges of cities that could no longer afford to feed them. Then there were the nights spent on the rails. For those trying to get to California or somewhere better, survival meant riding the rods. You didn't sit in a passenger car, you climbed underneath the train and balanced on the iron rods that held the chassis together. To survive a night like that was a terrifying feat of endurance. You were inches from the track, moving at 60 miles per hour in total darkness, with the freezing wind whipping your clothes and the roar of the engine drowning out your own thoughts. If you fell asleep, you died, so men would tie themselves to the rods with leather belts or bits of twine. They'd spend 8 hours in a state of hyper-vigilant terror, their fingers numbing until they felt like wooden pegs, praying the train wouldn't hit a bump that would send them under the wheels. It was a night spent staring into the literal abyss, surviving purely on the hope that there was a job waiting at the end of the line.
Back in the cities, the flop houses offered a different kind of survival. For a nickel, you could get a bed, which was actually just a canvas sheet stretched over a frame, or sometimes just a spot on the floor. The smell was a cocktail of cheap gin, unwashed bodies, and the lingering scent of despair. But it was better than the nickel sit. In some cities, you could pay 5 cents to sit in a chair in a heated room all night. You weren't allowed to sleep. If your head nodded, the attendant would poke you with a stick. You were paying for the right to stay warm and conscious. It was a brutal, slow-motion survival that stripped away everything but the basic biological need to not freeze. But there was a strange, quiet dignity in how people survived these nights. In the rural Dust Bowl, families would hang wet sheets over the windows and doors to catch the silt that blew in through every crack. They'd wake up in the morning to find a perfect, dusty silhouette of their own bodies on the bed sheets. They survived the night by breathing through damp cloths, their lungs slowly filling with the very dirt they used to farm. It was a slow, gritty endurance. They didn't have much, but they had the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair and the low hum of a battery-powered radio, connecting them to a world that felt like it was on the other side of the moon. As the decade wore on, the night remained a testing ground for human resilience. Whether it was a man tied to the bottom of a freight car or a mother dampening sheets in a dust storm, the goal remained the same: to endure, to wait out the dark and the cold and the hunger until the light returned. And as we move into our next chapter, we'll see how the world's nights were about to change again, as the shadows of the Depression gave way to the literal shadows of the Great Blackout. Chapter 8: The Great Blackout and the London Underground. By the 1940s, the night didn't just belong to the cold anymore. It belonged to the silence of the blackout. For the ordinary person in London during the Blitz, surviving a night that should have killed them became a literal exercise in subterranean living. When the sirens wailed at dusk, the city transformed into a void. Street lights were extinguished, car headlamps were hooded until they were mere slivers of light, and if you dared to let a single crack of yellow glow escape your window, the air raid warden would be at your door, shouting about how you were practically inviting a bomber to drop by for tea. To survive a night in London, thousands of people fled to the Tube, the deep underground railway stations. Imagine the scene: thousands of ordinary people carrying their pillows, their kittles, and their knitting, descending onto the platforms. They slept on the tracks, with the power off, luckily, on the escalators, and on narrow bunks bolted to the walls. It was a masterpiece of keeping calm and carrying on, which is really just a polite way of saying everyone was incredibly tired and smelled of damp wool. The air was thick, hot, and smelled of ozone and human breath. They survived by creating a bizarre temporary society. There were sing-alongs, mobile libraries, and even tea trains that would pull into the stations to distribute refreshments.
You survived the night not by hiding, but by pretending that sleeping on a concrete platform next to a stranger snoring bulldog was a perfectly normal British tradition. If you stayed at home, survival took the form of the Morrison shelter. This was essentially a heavy steel table that you put in your dining room. When the bombs started falling, the whole family would crawl under the table and try to sleep. It was cramped, cold, and gave you a fantastic view of everyone's ankles. But if the house collapsed, the table was designed to hold the weight of the rubble. People would tuck themselves in with their pets and their most prized possessions, listening to the crump of the anti-aircraft guns. They survived through a kind of detached stoicism, because why worry about the roof falling in when you have a perfectly good thermos of tea and a crossword puzzle to finish? Let's float over to the rural night watches of the same era. While the cities were hunkering down, the countryside was a landscape of listening posts. Ordinary men and women, members of the Royal Observer Corps, would sit on wooden platforms in the middle of dark fields, wearing heavy greatcoats and clutching binoculars. Their job was to identify enemy aircraft by the sound of their engines. To survive a night like that was to become an expert in the hush. You'd sit for 8 hours in a freezing mist, your world reduced to the glow of a single cigarette and the distant rhythmic thrum of a Junkers 88. They survived by sheer focus, turning their ears into radar dishes and their patience into a weapon. But the blackout wasn't just about bombs, it was about the dangers of the dark itself. In a world without streetlights, the simple act of walking home became a survival challenge. People painted white stripes on the trunks of trees and the edges of curbs so they wouldn't walk into them. You'd wear a small blackout button on your lapel, a tiny piece of glow-in-the-dark plastic so people wouldn't collide with you on the sidewalk. There was a spike in accidents involving people walking into lampposts, falling into canals, or being hit by silent buses. Surviving the night meant developing a kind of bat-like sonar, feeling for the texture of the pavement with your feet and listening for the rustle of other people moving in the ink-black shadows. There was also the weird, quiet tragedy of the shelter mentality. For some, the night became the only time they felt safe, tucked away in the belly of the earth. When the war finally ended and the lights came back on, many people found they couldn't sleep without the low-frequency hum of the ventilation fans or the presence of 100 other breathing bodies. They had adapted so well to the survival version of the night that the normal version felt exposed and lonely. As we look at these nights of the 1940s, we see the ultimate evolution of the human huddle, from the cow-scented huts of the 1200s to the soot-stained tube stations of 1941. The strategy remained remarkably consistent. Find a pocket of shared warmth, keep your spirits up with a bit of dark humor, and wait for the sun to prove that the world is still there. The night has always been a challenge, a period of time when we are forced to acknowledge that we are small, fragile things, but things that are remarkably good at not giving up.
Chapter 9. The Fallout Shelters and the Neon Anxiety of the 50s. As we drift into the 1950s, the night took on a very specific, polished kind of dread. This was the era of the Cold War, where survival wasn't just about escaping the frost or the soot, but about escaping the very atoms of the atmosphere. The ordinary person's night was now haunted by the possibility of the flash. For the first time, survival became a matter of interior design. This was the golden age of the backyard fallout shelter, a subterranean survival strategy that felt like a suburban version of the medieval longhouse, only instead of a cow for warmth, you had a Geiger counter and a crate of canned peaches. To survive a night in a 1950s fallout shelter was to participate in a high-stakes rehearsal for the end of the world. Families would occasionally hold drill nights where they'd pack into a concrete room buried under 6 feet of dirt. It was cramped, it was humid, and it smelled intensely of rubber and floor wax. You'd sleep on metal bunk beds, listening to the hum of a hand-cranked air filter. They survived the boredom and the claustrophobia by embracing a strange domestic ritualism. They'd play board games by the light of a battery-powered lantern and eat survival biscuits that tasted like a mixture of cardboard and optimism. It was a bizarre, manufactured night, a way of pretending that 6 inches of concrete could keep the 20th century from knocking on the door. Outside the shelters, the night was changing in a more luminous way. This was the era of neon. If you were a traveler on the newly built interstates, survival meant finding the glowing vacancy sign of a roadside motel. These motels were the descendants of the stagecoach inns, but instead of sharing a bed with a sweaty soldier, you had a magic fingers vibrating mattress and a television that played nothing but static after midnight. To survive a night in a mid-century motel was to exist in a state of transit, a liminal space where the air conditioning hummed like a jet engine and the curtains were thick enough to block out the glow of the 24-hour diner across the street. You survived the road by surrendering to the neon-lit convenience, a world where the night was no longer something to be feared, but something to be navigated with a map and a tank of leaded gasoline. Let's float over to the night watchers of the early atomic age. In the 1950s, thousands of ordinary citizens volunteered for the Ground Observer Corps. Much like the watchers of the Blitz, these people sat on the roofs of office buildings and in specialized towers, scanning the horizon for the silhouette of a Soviet T-95 bomber. They survived the long, cold hours with thermoses of black coffee and a sense of patriotic duty that bordered on the obsessive. They were the eyes of a nation that was terrified of being caught sleeping. In their minds, the survival of their entire city depended on their ability to distinguish a distant plane from a particularly bright star. It was a lonely, quiet vigil, a return to the ancient tradition of the village sentinel, updated for an age of jet engines and radar. Then there was the psychological survival of the night shift in the burgeoning world of automated factories. As the 1950s gave way to the 60s, more and more ordinary people were working under the flicker of fluorescent lights. These lights didn't just illuminate the room, they stripped away the natural cues of the night. To survive a night in a chemical plant or high-tech manufacturing floor, workers developed micro-sleeps, seconds-long bursts of unconsciousness that allowed the brain to reset while the eyes stayed open. They lived in a perpetual state of jet lag without ever leaving their hometown. They survived by creating a subculture of the nocturnal, where breakfast was eaten at 4 p.m. and the world of the day people felt like a distant, overly bright dream. And we can't forget the survival of the nighttime reader. In the mid-20th century, before the internet offered a million distractions, the night was the realm of the paper-bound book. Ordinary people would stay up until the small hours, huddled under a single reading lamp, traveling to worlds far removed from the anxieties of the Cold War. It was a mental survival tactic, a way of reclaiming the quiet hours for the self. Whether it was a detective novel or a travelogue, the book was a shield against the silence of the suburban night, a way of keeping the mind engaged when the world outside was locked in a duck-and-cover crouch. As we look back at these nights of the 50s and 60s, we see a world trying to balance its incredible technological progress with its primal fears. We had conquered the dark with neon and electricity, yet we were burying ourselves in the ground to escape the light of our own inventions. The survival strategies were cleaner, more organized, and infinitely more anxious. But at the core, it was the same human impulse that drove Geoffrey the peasant to sleep near his cow, the need to feel secure, to find a pocket of quiet, and to make it through the shadows to the promise of a brand new day. Chapter 10: The Concrete Canyons and the 1970s Power Failure. As we drift into the 1970s, the night took on a gritty, grainy texture, like an old film reel that's been played at few too many times. This was the decade where the great urban centers, once beacons of progress, started to feel a bit frayed at the edges.
Survival for the ordinary city dweller wasn't about polar ice or fallout shelters anymore. It was about navigating a landscape where the infrastructure was tired and the social contract was feeling a little thin. And nothing tested that survival quite like the Great Blackout of 1977 in New York City. Imagine it's a humid July night. The air is so thick you could practically carve it. Suddenly, the hum of the city, that constant low-frequency vibration we've grown to rely on, just stops. The lights go out, the air conditioning dies, and millions of people are plunged into a darkness that hasn't been seen in Manhattan for decades. To survive a night like this was to experience a total collapse of the modern world. People didn't huddle in tube stations this time. They spilled out onto the streets. Some were there to help, some were there to cause chaos, but most were just trying to figure out how to get to the 22nd floor of an apartment building without an elevator. For the ordinary person trapped in a high-rise, survival meant turning your balcony into a campsite. You'd drag your mattress outside because the heat inside the concrete box of your apartment had become unbearable. You'd sleep on the night by listening to the strange new sounds of a silent city, the distant shouting, the sirens, and the eerie absence of the subway rumble. It was a return to a primal state of vigilance. People who hadn't spoken to their neighbors in 5 years were suddenly sharing lukewarm beer and flashlights, forming impromptu floor watches to make sure no one uninvited was coming up the stairwell. It was a communal survival born of necessity, a brief moment where the anonymity of the city was stripped away by a blown transformer.
Let's float over to the night runners of the 70s, the burgeoning subculture of urban explorers and graffiti artists. For these people, surviving the night was an athletic pursuit. They didn't see the dark as a threat, they saw it as a canvas and a playground. To survive a night in a train yard or an abandoned warehouse, you had to be a ghost. You navigated by the smell of damp concrete and the feel of rusted iron under your palms. You survived by knowing the exact timing of the transit police patrols and the specific creak of a fence that meant you needed to vanish. It was a high-stakes game played for no reward other than seeing your name on a subway car the next morning. They were the modern descendants of the Toshers, finding value in the places everyone else had forgotten. Then there was the psychological survival of the midnight movie crowd. In the 70s, the night became a refuge for the weird. Ordinary people would flock to crumbling theaters at midnight to watch cult films, creating a ritualistic, smoke-filled sanctuary. It was a way of surviving the mundanity of the day-to-day. In that dark theater, surrounded by people who all felt a little bit like misfits, you weren't an office clerk or a student. You were part of a secret society. They survived the long night of the 1970s economy by leaning into the surreal, finding comfort in the strange and the transgressive. And we can't forget the truckers, the knights of the road. In the 70s, the CB radio became the ultimate survival tool for the nocturnal traveler. To survive a night hauling freight across the desert, you lived in a world of handles and static. Breaker 19, anyone got their ears on? The radio was a lifeline, a way to stay awake and alert by talking to a stranger 3 miles ahead. They survived the hypnotic white line fever by sharing warnings about smoky bears, police, or seat covers, passengers. It was a digital version of the old campfire stories, a way of populating the lonely dark with human voices, ensuring that even in the middle of nowhere, you weren't truly alone. As the decade drew to a close, the night began to change again. The grit of the 70s started to give way to the neon-soaked, synthesized glow of the 80s. But for a few years there, surviving the night meant dealing with a world that felt like it was breaking down. It was a time of flashlights, CB radios, and the quiet resilience of people who realize that even when the power goes out, the human spirit is remarkably good at finding its way through the dark. Whether it was a family on a hot New York balcony or a trucker on a lonely stretch of I-80, the goal remained what it has always been: keep moving, keep talking, and wait for the sun to hit the horizon. Chapter 11: The Digital Glow and the Midnight Hackers.
As we slide into the 1980s, the night stopped being pitch black and started being, well, neon blue. The way an ordinary person survived the small hours changed from physical endurance to a sort of glowing sedentary obsession. This was the era of the first personal computers, those beige plastic boxes that hummed with the power of a modern calculator but felt like magic. To survive a night in 1984 involved staring at a cathode ray tube monitor until your retinas felt like they'd been lightly toasted. Let's float into the bedroom of an early hacker or a BBS enthusiast. While the rest of the world was sleeping, these people were the pioneers of a new kind of nocturnal survival, the digital frontier. To survive the night, you had to navigate the handshake of a 1200 baud modem. It was a high-pitched, screeching sound that felt like a robotic banshee, and if your parents heard it, your night was over. So survival meant burying the modem under a pile of pillows to muffle the noise. You'd sit there in the dark, the only light coming from the green or amber text scrolling across the screen, chatting with someone 3 states away about a cracked copy of a game. It was a lonely, quiet kind of survival. These SYOPs, system operators, would run bulletin board systems out of their bedrooms. They survived on a diet of Jolt Cola, which had all the sugar and twice the caffeine, because why not just skip the middleman and give your heart palpitations directly? The goal was to stay awake long enough to see a file finish downloading, which at those speeds could take roughly 3 to 4 business days. They were the night watchmen of the information age, guarding their digital territories, while the daywalkers had no idea a second world was being built in the phone lines. Moving outside the bedroom, the 1980s night was defined by the 24-hour convenience store. The 7-Eleven became the modern watering hole, a sanctuary of fluorescent light where you could survive a midnight slump with a Slurpee and a lukewarm hot dog that had been on the roller since the previous administration. For the graveyard shift worker, survival meant friending the regulars, the cab drivers, the insomniacs, and the people who just liked the way the linoleum looked at 3 a.m. It was a sterile, brightly lit kind of peace. You survived the night by leaning into the artificiality of it all, buffered from the dark by a wall of cigarette cartons and plastic-wrapped snacks. Then there was the rave culture that began to bleed into the late 80s and early 90s. This was the ultimate challenge for the youth. To survive a night at an illegal warehouse party, you needed 2 things, a Vicks vapor rub stick and a very high tolerance for repetitive bass lines. These people were the modern descendants of the midnight movie crowd, but with more glow sticks. They'd dance for 10 hours straight in a building that probably hadn't been up to code since the Great Depression. They survived through a collective rhythmic trance, a way of opting out of the morning person economy entirely. When the sun came up, they didn't go to work. They went to a diner, blinking like owls in the harsh light of the real world, trying to remember what silence felt like.
Chapter 12. The 24-Hour City and the Blue Light Insomnia. As we drift into the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the night didn't just get brighter, it became a choice. For the first time in human history, the biological necessity of sleep was being marketed as a lifestyle option. This was the era of the true 24-hour city, where the ordinary person was no longer fighting the elements or the dark, but fighting their own circadian rhythms. To survive a night in this era was to navigate a world that never actually closed, a landscape of blue-tinted screens and the hum of servers that never slept. Imagine the cubicle of a software engineer in the late 90s working through the Y2K panic. Survival meant a mountain of empty pizza boxes and a level of caffeine consumption that would make a Victorian night soil man faint. These people were the modern guardians of the calendar, convinced that if they didn't stay awake to fix a few lines of code, the entire global financial system would turn into a pumpkin at midnight on December 31st. They survived on crunch time, a state of perpetual wakefulness where the difference between 2 p.m. and 2 a.m. was purely theoretical. The night was just low traffic hours,
a time to push updates and drink lukewarm energy drinks while the rest of the world dreamed of analog clocks. Let's float over to the night shift of the globalized economy. By the early 2000s, an ordinary person in a call center in Bangalore might be working the night to align with the day in New York. To survive this, they had to effectively gaslight their own bodies. They lived in a world of blackout curtains and white noise machines, trying to convince their pineal gland that 10 a.m. was actually midnight. It was a reverse survival, a quiet, lonely struggle to stay connected to a family that lived in the sun while they lived in the shadows. They survived by creating night families with their coworkers, sharing lunch at 3 a.m. in a brightly lit cafeteria that felt like a space station orbiting a sleeping planet. Then there was the rise of the blue light insomniac. As the first smartphones and high-speed home internet became common, the survival challenge moved from the body to the mind. You weren't trying to stay warm, you were trying to stay off. The night became a battleground of doom scrolling before the word even existed. You'd lie in bed, the blue light of the screen inhibiting your melatonin production, scrolling through forums or early social media until 4 a.m. You survived the next day through a haze of brain fog and micro-naps on the commuter train. It was a slow, digital erosion of the second sleep we talked about at the beginning. We had finally conquered the dark, only to find that we didn't know what to do with the light. Let's consider the night patrols of the modern era, the paramedics and emergency room nurses. To survive a night in a modern ER is to see the human condition at its most raw and exhausted. They live on hospital coffee, a substance that is legally distinct from water, and a very specific kind of gallows humor. They survived by becoming night specialists, people who knew that the world is a very different place between the hours of 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. They saw the bar rush injuries, the silent crises of the elderly, and the quiet arrivals of the newest members of the species. For them, the night wasn't a void, it was a shift. They survived by being the steady, glowing heart of a city that was otherwise unconscious. And finally, we look at the quiet survival of the modern parent. In every era, from the medieval hut to the suburban semi-detached, the night has been defined by the night feed. To survive a night with a newborn is to experience time as a series of disjointed, blurry intervals. You sit in a rocking chair in a dark room, the only sound being the rhythmic breathing of a tiny human, and for a moment you are connected to every parent who has ever lived. You survive through a mixture of bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, quiet peace. You are the guardian of the next generation's sleep, a silent sentinel in a world that is otherwise obsessed with being loud. As we reach the end of our journey through these nights that should have killed us, we see that the story of human survival is really just a story of adaptation. We've moved from cow-huddled huts to neon-lit diners to blue light-filled bedrooms, but the goal remains the same. We are small, fragile, warm-blooded things in a universe that is vast, cold, and very dark. But we have fire, we have wool, we have coffee, and most importantly, we have each other. We survive the night because we know, deep in our bones, that the sun always, eventually, comes back up. I hope this long, quiet look at our ancestors' struggles has helped you settle into your own blankets. The world outside is dark, but you are warm, you are safe, and you are tucked away. Would you like me to dive into a new topic for another long journey? Perhaps the history of the world's most elaborate and useless royal etiquette? Or maybe a guide to the most dysfunctional dynasties of the Mediterranean? Chapter 13: The Most Inbred Monarchs in European History. Since you're still awake, or perhaps just drifting in that pleasant, hazy space between thoughts, let's float away from the freezing huts and neon diners. Instead, let's glide into the gilded, suffocating hallways of European royalty. If surviving a winter night was a feat of physical endurance, surviving a royal lineage was often a feat of biological defiance. Tonight, we're going to look at the people who were born into the most exclusive, expensive, and genetically questionable clubs in history. We're talking about the monarchs who were so inbred that their family trees weren't really trees. They were more like decorative shrubs, or perhaps a single very confused vine. We have to start, of course, with the Habsburgs. If you've ever seen a portrait of a 17th century Spanish king and thought he looked like a half-baked potato with a very heavy drawer attached to his face, you were looking at the Habsburg jaw. The Habsburgs were the masters of the strategic marriage, which is a polite way of saying they were terrified of their jewelry leaving the family. Their motto was, "Let others wage war, but thou, happy Austria, marry." And they married. They married their cousins, their nieces, and their second cousins twice removed, until the family DNA was basically just a loop. The ultimate result of this genetic doubling down was Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. He was called the Bewitched because nobody in the 1700s wanted to admit that his problems were the result of 2 centuries of uncles marrying their nieces. Charles was the human equivalent of a Control-C, Control-V error. His jaw was so large and misshapen that his upper and lower teeth didn't meet, meaning he couldn't chew his food. His tongue was so oversized that he could barely be understood when he spoke. He didn't walk until he was nearly an adult, and he was plagued by a list of ailments that read like a medical textbook's index. These people were the modern guardians of the calendar, convinced that if they didn't stay awake to fix a few lines of code, the entire global financial system would turn into a pumpkin at midnight on December 31st. They survived on crunch time, a state of perpetual wakefulness where the difference between 2 p.m. and 2 a.m. was purely theoretical. The night was just low traffic hours, a time to push updates and drink lukewarm energy drinks while the rest of the world dreamed of analog clocks.
But the real irony of Charles's life was that he was the ruler of a global empire. While he was struggling to digest his dinner and being exorcised by priests who thought his health was the work of a demon, he was technically the most powerful man in the world. He survived 38 years in a body that was essentially trying to fold itself in half. His life wasn't a tragedy of war or betrayal. It was a tragedy of a family that loved its own reflection a little too much. To survive a night in the palace of Charles II was to live in a world of whispered prayers, specialized soft foods, and the heavy, dusty silence of a dynasty that was literally running out of steam. Let's float over to the French court, which was slightly less inbred but significantly more dramatic. If the Habsburgs were about genetic stagnation, the Bourbons were about emotional meltdowns. Take, for instance, the Sun King, Louis XIV. He was the pinnacle of royal style, but his personal life was a revolving door of digestive issues and very public bathroom habits. He lived in Versailles, a palace that cost more than some small countries, yet it didn't have enough toilets. To survive a night at Versailles was to navigate a world of velvet finery and the distinct, lingering scent of 1,000 aristocrats who didn't believe in plumbing. The royalty of this era survived through etiquette. Etiquette was the armor they wore to pretend they weren't biological disasters. There was a specific way to hand the king his shirt, a specific way to watch him eat soup, and a specific way to stand when he walked past. It was a 24-hour performance. If you were a courtier, your survival depended on your ability to stay awake during a 6-hour opera while wearing a wig that weighed 10 pounds and contained a small ecosystem of lice. It was a life of extreme luxury and extreme discomfort, a gilded cage where everyone was watching everyone else for a slip in protocol.
Then we have the tragic, sickly children of these dynasties. In the medieval and early modern periods, being a royal child didn't mean you were safe. It meant you were a pawn. These children were wrapped in swaddling cloths made of the finest silk, but they were also fed pap, bread soaked in weak beer, and rarely washed. They survived, or often didn't, in nurseries that were drafty and filled with the smoke of expensive tallow candles. If a royal child made it to age 10, it was considered a minor miracle. They were the most spoiled and the most vulnerable people in the world, living in a golden bubble that could be popped by a single bad oyster or a stray sneeze from a visiting ambassador. As we look at these monarchs, we see a different kind of night survival. It wasn't about the cold or the hunger, it was about the weight of the crown and the slow, inevitable decline of a bloodline that had nowhere left to go. They lived in palaces that were built to last 1,000 years, yet their own bodies were failing them after 30. It's a quiet, ironic contrast, the absolute power of the throne held by someone who couldn't even stand up without help. Chapter 14: The Romanovs and the Hidden Hemorrhage. As we move east toward the sprawling, snow-covered plains of Russia, the royal night takes on a much darker, more somber tone. We're stepping into the Winter Palace, a building so vast it had its own internal climate. To survive a night in the Romanov court was to live in a state of exquisite, gilded paranoia. While the Habsburgs were dealing with jaws that wouldn't shut, the Romanovs, specifically toward the end, were dealing with blood that wouldn't clot. This brings us to the tragedy of Alexei Nikolaevich, the last Tsarevich of Russia. He was the great-grandson of Queen Victoria, who was essentially the patient zero of the royal hemophilia crisis. Because European royals insisted on marrying only each other, treating the continent like a very small, very expensive dating app, the royal disease spread through the palaces like a slow-motion wildfire. To be a Romanov child, like Alexei, was to live in a world made of cotton wool. He was surrounded by sailors whose only job was to make sure he didn't trip, because a single bruised knee could result in weeks of agonizing internal bleeding. The survival of the Romanov night revolved around a secret. The public didn't know the heir to the throne was essentially a glass doll. Behind the heavy velvet curtains of the Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar and Tsarina lived in a state of permanent, high-alert exhaustion. They survived by turning to mysticism, which is how we ended up with Rasputin. Imagine being an ordinary servant in that palace, walking down a hallway at 3 a.m. and seeing a bearded, unwashed monk whispering over the bed of a feverish child while the empress wept into her pearls. It wasn't just a political crisis, it was an emotional meltdown happening in the most expensive real estate in Eurasia. Let's float over to another Romanov quirk, the bizarre life of Peter the Great. Peter hated the traditional, suffocating nights of the Russian nobility. To survive a night with Peter was to survive a literal marathon of drinking. He created the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, which was basically a government-mandated frat party that lasted for days. If you were an aristocrat, you couldn't leave. You had to drink from the cup of the Great Eagle, a vessel that held about 1.5 liters of vodka until you passed out or died of embarrassment. Peter survived the night by sheer force of will and a terrifying amount of energy. His courtiers survived by hoping he'd get distracted by a nearby shipyard or a set of dental tools. Yes, Peter was obsessed with dentistry. To survive a night at his court, you had to make sure you didn't complain about a toothache. If Peter heard you had a sore mouth, he'd excitedly produce his bag of pliers and perform surgery on the spot, regardless if he actually needed it or if he had any idea what he was doing. He had a collection of teeth he'd pulled from his patients, which he kept in a little bag like a morbid tooth fairy. It was a world of absolute power channeled through the whims of a man who stood 6'8" and had the impulse control of a caffeinated toddler. Then we have the tragic, sickly children of these dynasties. In the medieval and early modern periods, being a royal child didn't mean you were safe. It meant you were a pawn. These children were wrapped in swaddling cloths made of the finest silk, but they were also fed pap, bread soaked in weak beer, and rarely washed. They survived, or often didn't, in nurseries that were drafty and filled with the smoke of expensive tallow candles. If a royal child made it to age 10, it was considered a minor miracle. They were the most spoiled and the most vulnerable people in the world, living in a golden bubble that could be popped by a single bad oyster or a stray sneeze from a visiting ambassador. As we look at these monarchs, we see a different kind of night survival. It wasn't about the cold or the hunger, it was about the weight of the crown and the slow, inevitable decline of a bloodline that had nowhere left to go. They lived in palaces that were built to last 1,000 years, yet their own bodies were failing them after 30. It's a quiet, ironic contrast, the absolute power of the throne held by someone who couldn't even stand up without help.
As we look at these later monarchs, we see that royal survival had shifted from the physical to the psychological. They had the best heaters, the softest beds, and the most security, yet they were often the most miserable people on the planet. They were trapped by their own blood, their own titles, and their own bizarre eccentricities. They survived the night by hiding from it, or by drinking through it, or by pretending it wasn't happening at all. Chapter 15, The Victorian Nursery and the Shadow of the Coburgs. As we float back toward the damp, foggy shores of England, the royal night shifts into a world of stiff lace and heavy mahogany. We've reached the era of Queen Victoria, a woman who spent 40 years surviving the night by mourning it. But before she became the grandmother of Europe, she was a child in the Kensington system, a survival strategy so suffocating it would make a modern tiger parent look like a hippie. Victoria survived her childhood nights by never being alone, not for a single second. She slept in her mother's room until the day she became queen at 18. She wasn't allowed to walk down the stairs without someone holding her hand. This wasn't because she was clumsy. It was because her mother and a very ambitious man named Sir John Conroy were terrified she might die, or worse, develop an independent thought before they could use her to gain power. To survive a night in the Kensington system was to live in a state of constant velvet-wrapped surveillance. When she finally became queen and moved her bed out of her mother's room, it wasn't just a change of furniture, it was a biological revolution. But then came the marriages. Victoria married her cousin, Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert was brilliant, hard-working, and carried the genetic blueprint of a family that was increasingly obsessed with its own lineage. To survive a night in the household of Victoria and Albert was to live by a schedule so rigorous it was timed to the second. Albert believed that the night was for self-improvement and cold air. He redesigned the palaces with the latest Victorian technology, huge clanking heating systems that never quite worked, and windows that were kept open to let in the healthful frost. The result was a nursery full of children who were the most famous and most photographed in the world, yet they were living through a very high-class version of a medical experiment. To survive a night in the royal nursery, a child had to endure hardening. They were bathed in cold water, fed plain food, and dressed in kilts even when the Scottish Highlands were literally freezing over. It was believed that this would create a sturdy moral character. Instead, it created a generation of royals who were perpetually catching colds and harboring deep-seated resentments. And then there was the Coburg curse. As Victoria and Albert's 9 children grew up and married into every other royal house in Europe, they took with them the hidden flaw we discussed in the Romanovs, hemophilia. The night of the royals became a game of genetic Russian roulette. You could be the most powerful princess in Prussia or Spain, but if you had a son, your nights were spent in a state of terror, watching for the first sign of a bruise. They survived through a kind of stoic denial, writing thousands of letters to each other about their health, their diets, and their nerves, while the very foundation of their dynasties was beginning to crumble from the inside out.
Let's float over to the sad and spoiled world of the medieval royal children for a moment, just to see how much things hadn't changed. In the 14th century, a royal baby survived the night by being swaddled so tightly they couldn't move. This was meant to keep their limbs straight, but it effectively turned them into a silk-covered log. They were often placed in the care of rockers, servants whose only job was to keep the cradle moving all night long. Imagine the job of a royal rocker, sitting in a dim, drafty stone room, rhythmically pushing a wooden cradle for 12 hours, knowing that if the future King of England wakes up and cries, it's technically your fault. These children lived in a world of extreme contrast. They might eat off gold plates, but they also lived in buildings where the garderobe, the toilet, was often just a hole in the wall a few feet from where they slept. They survived the night through the sheer luck of their immune systems. If they survived the sweating sickness or the king's evil, they grew up to be monarchs who were often emotionally stunted and physically fragile. They were spoiled in the sense that they never heard the word no, but they were sickly because the science of the time thought that washing your face was a dangerous indulgence. As the Victorian era faded into the 20th century, the royal night became a spectacle for the masses. The ordinary person could now read about the king's insomnia in the morning newspaper. The survival of the monarchy depended on them being relatable while also remaining divine. A psychological tightrope walk that led to many a royal meltdown behind closed doors. They survived the night with the help of equerries and ladies of the bedchamber, a small army of people whose job was to ensure the queen's tea was exactly 70 degrees Celsius and that her pillows were fluffed to a specific regal density. It's a strange thing to think about, isn't it? Whether it was a medieval prince in a drafty tower or a Victorian princess in a drafty palace, the nights were never truly their own. They were the property of the state, the property of their bloodline, and the property of history. They survived the dark just like everyone else, with a bit of warmth, a bit of luck, and a lot of waiting for the morning. But they did it under the weight of a crown that never really let them rest. I hope you're feeling very, very lip-led now. The history of the world is long, but your night is just beginning. You've traveled from the cow-scented huts of the peasants to the gilded, genetic mazes of the kings. The fire is out, the frost is on the window, and the story is done for now.
Chapter 16. The Grand Exit and the Ethics of Eternal Rest. As we drift into the final hours of our journey, it seems only fitting that we look at how the royals and the elite managed to survive the ultimate night. If you thought royal weddings were over the top, you haven't seen a royal funeral from the 18th or 19th centuries. This was the era where surviving the night meant making sure your physical body was treated with more respect than it probably ever received while you were actually using it. To the elite, death wasn't an end, it was a rebranding opportunity. Take, for example, the bizarre tradition of lying in state. When a monarch died, they didn't just get a quiet burial. They had to survive weeks of being stared at by the public. To make this possible, the royal embalmers, who were often just court surgeons with a very grim side hustle, had to get creative. They would replace the monarch's fluids with a mixture of herbs, spices, and a lot of vinegar. It was essentially like pickling the king. To survive a night in a room with a lying-in-state monarch was a sensory challenge for the guards. They had to stand perfectly still for hours in a room filled with thousands of lilies, which were there less for decoration and more to mask the fact that the pickling process wasn't exactly a perfect science. Then there were the effigies. Sometimes the body was in such bad shape that the royals decided to use a wax dummy instead. These wax figures were disturbingly realistic, dressed in the deceased's actual clothes. They would be paraded through the streets on top of a coffin.
Imagine being an ordinary peasant in London in 1603, watching the funeral of Elizabeth I and seeing a pale, motionless version of the Queen staring back at you from a velvet carriage. It was a way of surviving the night of history, making sure the image of the monarch remained pristine and powerful, even as the biological reality was being hurried toward a lead-lined vault. Speaking of lead-lined vaults, let's float down into the crypts. Royal coffins were masterpieces of heavy metal engineering. They were triple-layered, wood on the inside, lead in the middle, and velvet-covered oak on the outside. Why lead? Because lead is airtight. It was the 18th century version of survival gear for the afterlife. If you seal a body in lead, it stays. Well, it stays contained. However, this led to a terrifying phenomenon known as the exploding coffin. If the gases from the pickling process built up too much pressure, the lead would eventually give way with a sound like a small cannon. To survive a night as a night watchman in the royal vault at Windsor was to live in constant fear that the Duke of Somewhere Important was about to make a very loud, very final exit from his container. But perhaps the strangest way the elite survived the night of death was through funeral biscuits. Yes, biscuits. In the Victorian era, it was common to give mourners a sponge biscuit wrapped in black-edged paper, often sealed with black wax. You'd take the biscuit home and eat it with a glass of port. It was a way of literalizing the phrase, consuming the memory of the dead. To survive the grief of a royal passing, the public was encouraged to have a snack. It's a wonderfully weird, dry-humored way to end a life, leaving behind a legacy of stone monuments, lead coffins, and a few thousand crumbs. Let's look at one last royal disaster, the heart burial. For centuries, it was fashionable for royals to have their hearts buried separately from their bodies. They survived the night of eternity by being in two places at once. Richard the Lionheart's heart was buried in Rouen, while his body was buried in Anjou. The heart would be placed in a small lead box or a silver urn. It was a romantic, if slightly gruesome, survival strategy, ensuring that your love stayed in one city while your duty stayed in another. It also meant that if a revolution happened and your tomb was desecrated, you had a backup organ hidden somewhere else. As we conclude this long, winding monologue through the shadows of history, we see that humans, whether they were peasants huddling with cows or kings huddling in lead boxes, have always been obsessed with getting through the dark. We've used fire, we've used wool, we've used genealogy, and we've used wax dummies. We are a species that simply refuses to stay quiet in the dark. I hope these stories have served their purpose, not to excite you, but to weigh down your eyelids with the sheer, heavy absurdity of our shared past. The nights of the 1200s are gone, the gaslight of the 1890s has flickered out, and the neon of the 1970s has faded. All that's left is the quiet hum of your own room and the soft, steady rhythm of your breathing. You've survived the history lesson. Now it's time to survive the night the easy way, by closing your eyes and letting go. Sleep well, and perhaps I'll see you in another century.
Simeon survived the night through a state of holy stubbornness. His disciples would pull up baskets of bread and water on a rope, and in return, Simeon would shout down blessings or perhaps just tell everyone to go away. He lived in a vertical wilderness. Imagine being a traveler in the year 440, walking through the desert at night and seeing a man silhouetted against the moon, standing on top of a 50-foot column like a very pious bird. It wasn't just a survival of the elements, it was a survival of the ego. By removing himself from the earth, Simeon felt he was closer to the stars, though he was also significantly closer to the lightning. Let's float over to the Meteora monasteries in Greece. These are hermitages on an industrial scale, built on top of immense natural sandstone pillars that look like giant fingers pointing at the sky. These monasteries were the ultimate no-entry zones. Until the 1920s, there were no stairs. If you wanted to get to the top to visit the monks, you had to be pulled up in a net. When asked how often the ropes were replaced, the monks famously replied, "When they break." To survive a night at Meteora was to be suspended between heaven and earth. The wind would howl around the stone cliffs, and the only light would come from a single flickering candle in a chapel filled with the scent of old incense and damp stone. The monks survived the isolation by embracing a life of holy boredom. They spent their nights in prayer, their days in silence, and their evenings staring at a horizon that never changed. It was a life of extreme verticality, where the outside world was just a blurry green carpet hundreds of feet below. They were safe from the wars and the plagues of the valley, but they were entirely at the mercy of a frayed rope and a heavy basket. Then we have the enclosed anchorites. This was a particularly intense form of survival found in medieval England. An anchorite was a person, often a woman, who was literally walled into a small cell attached to a church. They'd have a funeral service performed for them while they were still alive, and then the door would be bricked up. They had 3 windows, one into the church to hear Mass, one to receive food, and one to dispense advice to the local villagers. To survive a night as an anchorite was to live in a room no bigger than a walk-in closet for the rest of your life. You'd sleep on the stone floor, your world reduced to the sound of the church bells and the muffled voices of the congregation through the wall. It was a sensory deprivation chamber for the soul. They survived by creating an internal landscape so vast that the 4 walls of their cell didn't matter. Or they survived by going slightly mad and talking to the spiders. Either way, it was a night that lasted for decades, a survival of the ultimate stay-at-home order. Let's float down to the Hermit's Castle in the Scottish Highlands, the Achmelvich Hermitage. It's a tiny concrete structure no bigger than a dog kennel, built in the 1950s by an English architect who wanted to escape the modern world. He spent 6 months building it, stayed for 1 weekend, and then left because he realized that the peace and quiet of the Highlands mostly consisted of midges and freezing rain. It's a modern monument to the failed hermit, a reminder that surviving the night in total isolation is a lot harder than it looks in the brochures. As we look at these hermitages, we see that humans have a strange, recurring urge to disappear. We build pillars, we climb cliffs, and we wall ourselves into churches just to find a version of the night that belongs only to us. We survive the loneliness by turning it into a ritual, and we survive the silence by filling it with our own thoughts. The night is finally very deep now. The pillar saints have come down, the anchorites have finished their prayers, and the ropes at Meteora are still. You've traveled far enough for one night. The dark isn't something to survive anymore, it's something to rest in. Chapter 18. The Ghost Towns of the High Andes and the Deserted Altitudes. Since the pull of sleep is still just a hovering ghost, let's float far away from the stone cells of Europe and drift across the ocean to the thin, oxygen-deprived air of the high Andes. Here we find a different kind of survival, one where the night is so cold and the air so rare that it feels like you're sleeping on the moon. we're going to look at the ghost towns left behind by the nitrate and silver booms, places where ordinary people lived in conditions that would make a modern astronaut reconsider their career choices. Take, for instance, the town of Seoul in Chile. Known as the City of Stairs, it was built on the steep slopes of the Andes at an altitude where trees simply refused to grow. There were no roads, only thousands of brightly colored wooden stairs. To survive a night in Seoul in the 1920s was to live in a vertical labyrinth of snow and copper dust. Because the buildings were all made of wood and huddled together for warmth, the greatest threat wasn't the altitude, it was fire. If one house went up, the whole city risked becoming a mountain-sized torch. People slept with one ear open for the fire bell, their lungs working double time just to process the thin, icy air. The survival of these Andean miners was a feat of chemical endurance. They survived the brutal night shifts by chewing coca leaves, a mild stimulant that helped suppress hunger, cold, and the crushing fatigue of hauling ore from the belly of the mountains. They lived in campamentos, long, low-slung barracks, where the wind whistled through the corrugated iron roofs with a sound like a dying flute. To survive the night, you didn't just need a blanket, you needed a community. The miners and their families created a vibrant, colorful world in the middle of a gray, rocky wasteland, hosting dances and cinemas in buildings that seemed to be clinging to the cliffside by their fingernails. Let's float over to the ghost towns of the Atacama Desert, like Humberstone and Santa Laura. These were officina towns, built to harvest white gold, saltpeter. In the Atacama, it almost never rains, and the temperature swing between day and night is enough to crack stone. During the day, the sun is a physical weight. At night, the heat vanishes instantly, leaving you in a dry, brittle cold. To survive a night in an Atacama ghost town was to live in a house made of timber imported all the way from Oregon because there was no wood for 1,000 miles. The ordinary people here survived by creating a literal oasis in the dust. They built grand theaters and swimming pools in the middle of the most arid place on Earth, pretending for a few hours every night that they weren't surrounded by hundreds of miles of salt flats. They survived the silence of the desert by filling it with the clatter of the processing plants and the chatter of a dozen different languages, immigrants from all over the world drawn by the promise of work. Now, those towns are silent. The wind blows through the rusted machinery, and the only things surviving the night are the sun-bleached remains of a wooden rocking chair or a discarded leather boot, preserved by the salt and the lack of moisture.
Then there's the psychological survival of the Puna, the high, desolate plateau. Ancient travelers across these mountains survived the night by building apachetas, small mounds of stones. Every time you passed a high point, you added a stone to the pile as a thank you to the mountain spirits. It was a spiritual survival tactic. In a landscape that feels fundamentally indifferent to human life, the apacheta was a sign that someone else had been there, that someone else had survived the freezing wind and the thin air. To sleep near an apacheta was to feel, just for a moment, that you weren't alone in the vastness. Even the architecture of the Andes reflects this survival. The houses were built with thick adobe walls, mud and straw, that would soak up the sun's heat during the day and slowly release it into the room at night. It was a natural, low-tech battery. You'd huddle in the corner, wrapped in a poncho made of alpaca wool, which is warmer and more water-resistant than almost anything else on Earth. You survived by becoming as dense and as resilient as the Earth itself, tucking your chin into your collar and waiting for the first rays of the sun to hit the peaks. As we look at these high-altitude ghosts, we see a world that was pushed to the absolute limit of human habitability. People lived there not because it was easy, but because the Earth held something they wanted. They survived the night through a mixture of industrial grit, ancient wisdom, and the simple human desire to build a home, even if that home was on a cliffside 5 miles above the sea. The air in our story is getting thinner now, and the silence of the high peaks is taking over. The stairs of Seoul are empty.
The desert winds have quieted, and the apachetas are just shadows in the moonlight. You've climbed high enough for tonight. It's time to drift back down to the lowlands, where the air is thick and the bed is warm. Chapter 19. The Sunken Cities and the Silent Depths. Since the world of waking thought is still clinging on by a thread, let's leave the thin air of the Andes and sink down, slowly, quietly, into the heavy, pressurized silence of the Mediterranean. If the ghost towns of the mountains are preserved by salt and wind, the sunken cities of the ancient world are preserved by the weight of the sea itself. We're going to look at places like Baiae and Pavlopetri, where ordinary life didn't just end, it was submerged, tucked away in a watery night that has lasted for thousands of years. Imagine, if you will, the city of Baiae. In the time of the Roman Caesars, this was the ultimate party town. It was the Las Vegas of the ancient world, built on the vibrant volcanic shores of the Bay of Naples. It was a place of luxury villas, marble baths, and scandalous nights where the wine flowed like the nearby hot springs. But Baiae had a problem. It was built on a geological breather, a phenomenon called bradyseism. The ground didn't just shake, it breathed. Over centuries, the very land the city sat upon slowly, rhythmically exhaled, and the sea moved in to claim the streets. To survive a night in Baiae during its decline was to live in a state of slow-motion catastrophe. You'd go to sleep in your beautiful villa with its mosaic floors, and you'd wake up to find the sea lapping at your doorstep. You didn't leave because of a sudden volcano. You left because the tide simply stopped going out. Eventually, the grand statues of Venus and Hadrian weren't looking out over the water, they were under it. Today, you can drift in a boat over the clear blue waves and look down to see paved Roman roads and the foundations of shops, all perfectly preserved in a permanent liquid twilight. It is a city that survived the night of history by becoming a reef, a home for octopuses and sea anemones instead of senators and poets. Then there is Pavlopetri off the coast of Greece. It is perhaps the oldest submerged city in the world, dating back over 5,000 years. This wasn't a city of marble and excess, it was a city of merchants and families. To survive a night in Pavlopetri was to live in a world of stone houses and narrow alleys where the sound of the Aegean was the constant soundtrack to your life. When the earthquakes finally tilted the land into the sea, the city didn't crumble, it just settled. The survival of Pavlopetri is a miracle of chemistry. Because it was submerged in a protected bay, the silt covered the ruins, protecting the delicate layout of the rooms from the erosive power of the waves. You can still see the courtyards where children played and the looms where weavers worked their wool. It's a hauntingly domestic kind of ghost town. It survived the night not by fighting the ocean, but by surrendering to it. It exists now in a state of suspended animation, a blueprint of a human life that was interrupted by the Earth's shifting plates. Let's float over to the psychological survival of those who live near these liminal places. In many coastal cultures, the sunken city isn't just a pile of rocks, it's a legend. People tell stories of the city of Yis or Contrargualado, where on quiet nights you can still hear the church bells ringing beneath the waves. It's a way of surviving the grief of loss. If the city is still down there, ringing its bells, then the people aren't truly gone. They've just moved into a different kind of night. It's a comforting thought for a sailor in a storm, the idea that beneath the chaos of the surface, there is a world of stone and silence that remains unchanged. Even the way we visit these places is a form of survival. Marine archaeologists have to survive the physical limits of their own bodies to touch these ruins. They live in a world of decompression tables and nitrogen narcosis, moving slowly through the silt like ghosts visiting ghosts. They survive the underwater night by carrying their own air and their own light, illuminating a mosaic that hasn't seen the sun since the fall of the Roman Empire. It is a slow, respectful dialogue between the living and the drowned. As we look at these sunken worlds, we see that the night is not always a time of darkness. Sometimes it's a time of deep blue preservation. The cities didn't disappear, they just changed their address. They are the ultimate survivors, tucked away from the fires, the wars, and the bulldozers of the surface world. They are waiting quietly in the cool embrace of the Mediterranean for a morning that may never come. The air in our story is still and clear now. The marble floors of Baye are resting, the alleys of Pavlopetri are silent, and the bells of the sunken towers have stopped their ringing. You've drifted deep enough for tonight. It's time to float back down to the lowlands, where the air is thick and the bed is warm.
Since the final boundary of sleep is still a few whispers away, let's float out of the blue depths of the Mediterranean and drift across the scorched, shifting dunes of the Sahara and the Silk Road. We're seeking the most quiet of all places, the abandoned libraries of the ancient sands. These aren't the grand marble halls of Alexandria. These are the hidden stashes, the caves of manuscripts, and the forgotten desert outposts where the written word survived the night of history by being buried and ignored. Take, for instance, the library cave of Dunhuang. For 1,000 years, a small square room tucked into the side of a cliff in western China held a secret that the rest of the world had entirely forgotten. To survive a night in Dunhuang in the 11th century was to live at the crossroads of the world, a place where monks, merchants, and travelers swapped stories in dozens of languages. But when war approached, the monks did something remarkable. They stacked 50,000 scrolls, manuscripts in Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, and even Hebrew into a tiny side chamber, plastered over the entrance, and painted a mural on top of it. That library didn't just survive a night, it survived a millennium of darkness. Behind that plastered wall, the scrolls sat in a perfect, dry, oxygen-deprived silence. While empires rose and fell outside, while the Silk Road withered and the sands reclaimed the outposts, the words remained. They survived because they were forgotten. There is a strange irony in that. The most effective way to save a culture's memory was to hide it in a hole in the wall and hope nobody looked too closely. When the cave was finally opened in 1900, the world found a time capsule of human thought that had been sleeping for 900 years. Let's float over to the desert libraries of Chinguetti in Mauritania. These are not hidden in caves, but in the crumbling stone houses of a town that the dunes are slowly trying to swallow. Chinguetti was once a great center of Islamic scholarship, a place where pilgrims would stop on their way to Mecca to study law, astronomy, and poetry. To survive a night in Chinguetti today is to hear the sand rasping against the walls like sandpaper. The families who live there are the guardians of the books. They keep ancient leather-bound volumes in wooden trunks, passing them down from father to son. These librarians survive the night by engaging in a constant battle against the elements. Termites, moisture, and the relentless heat of the desert are the enemies of the page. They survive by using ancient techniques, placing the books in special niches to allow for airflow, or using dried desert plants to ward off insects. It's a fragile, dusty survival. You can sit in a dim room as the sun sets over the Sahara, and a librarian will carefully unfold a manuscript that describes the movement of the stars, written by a man who died 7 centuries ago. The book survived the night because someone decided that a few pieces of parchment were worth more than the gold that used to pass through the town. Then there's the psychological survival of the silent reader in the desert. In places like the ruins of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, archaeologists didn't find a library, they found a trash heap.
But because the Egyptian sand is so dry, the trash survived. Thousands of scraps of papyrus, tax receipts, private letters, shopping lists, and lost fragments of Sophocles were preserved in the ancient equivalent of a landfill. These weren't meant to survive, they were thrown away. But they survived the night of time because the desert is a perfect preservative. To read these scraps is to realize that the ordinary person of 2,000 years ago spent their nights worrying about the exact same things we do. There are letters from sons asking their fathers for more money, and notes from friends complaining about the heat. They survived not through grand monuments, but through the accidental resilience of their waste. It's a comforting, humble kind of history. We are not just our achievements, we are the things we leave behind in the sand. As we look at these desert libraries, we see that information is the ultimate survivor. It can endure heat, silence, and neglect as long as it finds a dry corner and a bit of shade. The scrolls of Dunhuang are now in museums. The trunks of Chinguetti are still being guarded, and the scraps of Oxyrhynchus are being pieced together by scholars. They have all made it through the long, hot night. The desert wind is dying down now, and the sand has settled into its drifts. The libraries are closed, the scrolls are rolled, and the guardians have gone to sleep. You've traveled far enough across the sands. It's time to let the quiet take over. The words have all been said, and the page is finally blank. I hope these journeys through the cold, the dark, the gilded, and the dry have helped you find your own way to rest. The world's history is a very long book, but for tonight, we've reached the final chapter. Chapter 21. The Sleeping Cities of the Arctic and the Iron Silence. Since the world of dreams hasn't quite pulled you under, let's leave the warm, dry sands and float north, far north, to the places where the night isn't just a period of time, but a permanent resident. We're going to look at the sleeping cities of the Arctic, specifically the abandoned mining outposts like Pyramiden and Grumont on the archipelago of Svalbard. These are places where the Soviet Union tried to build a socialist utopia on a frozen rock, only to walk away and leave the doors unlocked. Imagine, if you will, the town of Pyramiden. It was once a bustling coal mining community with a theater, a swimming pool, and the world's northernmost statue of Lenin. But in the late 1990s, the coal ran out, the money dried up, and the people simply left. To survive a night in Pyramiden today is to witness the ultimate iron silence. Because it is so cold, the process of decay has effectively gone on strike. There are no insects to eat the wood, and the air is too dry for much rust.
You can walk into the schoolhouse and see notebooks still sitting on the desks. In the canteen, the menus are still posted on the wall, offering borscht and black bread to workers who will never return. It's a city that has survived the night of abandonment by freezing itself in time. It doesn't feel dead. It feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for a shift change that is 25 years overdue. The only things that move are the shadows of the mountains and the occasional polar bear wandering through the town square, looking for a snack in a place that used to belong to us. Then there are the seed vaults, the ultimate survival tactic for the entire human race. Not far from these ghost towns, buried deep inside a mountain of permafrost, is the global seed vault. It is a library of life, a backup drive for the world's plants. To survive a night in the seed vault is to be tucked away in a series of chambers kept at exactly -18 degrees Celsius. There are no windows, no people, and no sound except for the faint hum of the cooling system. It is a silent, frozen cathedral of biodiversity. Millions of seeds from every corner of the earth, from the corn of Mexico to the rice of Thailand, are sleeping there in foil packets. They are surviving a night that could last for centuries. They are waiting for a morning that we hope never comes, the morning after a global catastrophe. It's a quiet, humbling thought. While we go about our lives worrying about our phones or our taxes, a mountain in the Arctic is quietly guarding the recipe for every meal we've ever eaten. Let's float over to the psychological survival of the winter overcruise in Antarctica. These are the modern descendants of the polar explorers we talked about earlier. To survive a night at the South Pole Station is to live in a building that is literally jacked up on stilts to keep it from being buried by drifting snow. During the 6 months of darkness, the crew is entirely isolated. No planes can land, and no ships can reach them. They survive by creating an artificial world of bright lights, indoor greenhouses, and movie nights. They develop a very specific kind of ice brain, a slow, meditative state where the outside world feels like a distant rumor. They survive the night by leaning into the absurdity of their situation. They might have a costume party in the middle of a blizzard, or spend 3 hours meticulously organizing a pantry full of frozen peas. It's a way of proving that they still have control over their environment, even when the environment is actively trying to freeze them solid. When the sun finally peeks over the horizon after months of dark, it's not just a sunrise, it's a biological homecoming. As we look at these Arctic outposts and frozen vaults, we see that the night is a place of preservation as much as it is a place of danger. We use the cold to keep our stories, our seeds, and our sanity intact. We build our utopias in the ice because we think they'll last forever. And even when we leave, the ice remains, guarding the silence we left behind. The wind on the tundra has died down now. The notebooks in Pyramiden are still. The seeds in the vault are sleeping, and the lights at the South Pole are dim. You've traveled far enough into the cold. It's time to float back to the warmth of your own room. The iron silence is a long way away, and your own night is finally, softly, drawing to a close. I hope these final stories have helped you find the stillness you need. The world is vast, the history is deep, but for now, the only thing that matters is the comfort of your own bed. Chapter 22. The Lighthouses and the Lonely Vigil. Since the shore of sleep is still just out of reach, let's float away from the frozen silence of the Arctic and drift toward the edges of the world, to the lighthouses. For centuries, the survival of thousands of sailors depended on the ability of a few ordinary men and women to survive the night in a stone tower. We're going to look at the Wickies, the lighthouse keepers, who lived in a world of brass, oil, and the endless, rhythmic crash of the sea. Imagine, if you will, being a keeper at a wave-swept station like Edstone or Minot's Ledge. These weren't the charming cottages you see on postcards. These were vertical stone pillars bolted directly into a rock that disappeared at high tide. To survive a night in a tower like that was to live inside a giant's drum. When a storm hit, the entire structure would vibrate with the impact of the waves, and the spray would reach the lantern room 100 feet above the water. You survived by trusting the masonry and by focusing on the service. The service was the ritual that kept you sane. Every night you had to trim the wicks, polish the silver reflectors, and wind the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens. If the light stopped spinning, ships died. It was that simple. To survive the boredom and the isolation, keepers developed a strange mechanical intimacy with their lights. They would talk to the gears, name the gusts of wind, and find comfort in the steady, sweeping beam that cut through the dark every 15 seconds. It was a life lived in increments of light, a survival of the watch. Then there was the smell of the lighthouse night. It wasn't just the salt air, it was the heavy, cloying scent of whale oil or lard, and later the sharp tang of kerosene. The keepers lived in a permanent cloud of fuel and soot. They survived the respiratory toll by keeping the ventilation fans humming and by spending their off hours in the gallery, the small outdoor walkway around the top of the tower. Imagine standing there at 3 a.m., the wind whipping your coat,
watching the distant lights of a passing freighter and knowing that the only reason they can see where they're going is because you spent 4 hours polishing a piece of glass. Let's float over to the psychological survival of the isolated keepers. In the early days, lighthouses were often manned by a single person. This led to what was known as lighthouse madness. To survive, the government eventually mandated that every station have at least 3 men. But even then, the night could be a test of character. If you didn't get along with your colleagues, you were trapped in a stone tube with them for months on end. You survived by developing a code of silence or by retreating into hobbies like model shipbuilding, knitting, or reading every word of the Bible cover to cover a dozen times. One of the most famous survival stories is that of the Flannan Isles in 1900. 3 keepers vanished from a remote Scottish lighthouse, leaving behind a perfectly tidy kitchen, a stopped clock, and a logbook that described a storm that, according to nearby ships, never actually happened. They didn't survive the night, but the mystery they left behind has survived for a century. It's a reminder that the night at sea has a way of swallowing the ordinary and turning it into something mythic.
But for most, survival was just a quiet satisfaction of a job done. They'd wake up as the sun hit the horizon, extinguish the lamp, and draw the heavy linen curtains to protect the Fresnel lens from the magnifying power of the sun. They'd eat a breakfast of salted pork and hardtack, and then they'd sleep while the ocean churned outside. They were the sentinels of the coast, the humans who turned the terrifying, chaotic night of the sea into a navigable map. As we look at these lonely towers, we see that survival is often about having a purpose. The keepers stayed awake so others could sleep. They faced the storm so others could find the harbor. They were the masters of the night, holding the line between the civilization of the land and the wildness of the water. The beam of the light is slowing down now. The wicks are trimmed, the silver is polished, and the sea has calmed to a gentle swell. You've watched the horizon long enough for one night. It's time to leave the tower and find your own harbor. The light is steady, the rocks are far away, and the night is finally, peacefully at rest. I hope these final chapters have guided you to the place where the stories end and the dreams begin. The world's long watch is over, and it's time for you to close your eyes. Chapter 23: The Remote Post Offices and the Paper Lifelines. Since the light of the tower hasn't quite faded into a dream, let's float to the furthest corners of the map, to the places where the only thing connecting a human to the rest of the world was a stamp and a prayer. If the lighthouse was a beacon of safety, the remote post office was a beacon of identity. To survive a night in a place like Port Lockroy in Antarctica or the Post Office Bay in the Galapagos was to survive on the hope that someone, somewhere, still knew you existed. Imagine the Post Office Bay on the island of Floriana. In the late 1700s, there was no building, no staff, and certainly no zip codes. There was just a wooden barrel. Whalers who had been away from home for years would drop their letters into the barrel, hoping that a ship heading in the opposite direction would stop, pick them up, and eventually deliver them to London or Nantucket. To survive a night in that bay was to live in a state of delayed connection. You'd leave a letter and then spend the next 2 years wondering if it ever reached your mother's hands. It was a postal system built entirely on the honor code of the high seas. Then there is the Penguin Post Office at Port Lockroy. To this day, it is the southmost post office in the world. To survive a night there, you have to be comfortable with the smell of guano and the sound of 2,000 Gentoo penguins arguing outside your window. The staff, mostly volunteers, spend their nights in a tiny, brightly painted shack sorting postcards sent by tourists who have traveled thousands of miles just to have an Antarctic postmark. They survive the isolation by becoming part of the landscape. They count the penguins, they monitor the ice, and they keep the coal stove burning against the -20°C wind. It's a survival of the message, a way of proving that even at the bottom of the world, we still feel the need to say, "I was here." Let's float over to the Himalayan postmen of India and Nepal. In the high mountain passes, the mail doesn't travel by truck, it travels by foot. These postmen survive the night in remote mountain huts, their bags filled with letters that are often the only source of news for isolated villages. To survive a night on the trail, they have to navigate landslides, snowstorms, and the sheer physical toll of climbing thousands of vertical feet a day. They are the human nervous system of the mountains. A letter from a son working in a city is more than just paper. It's a survival kit for the parents left behind, a reminder that the family bond is stronger than the altitude. In the 19th century American West, survival meant the Pony Express. A young rider would stay awake for 24 hours straight, switching horses every 10 miles, galloping through the night through territories that were often hostile. They survived by sheer speed and adrenaline. To a rider on a moonless night in Nevada, the post office wasn't a building, it was the leather pouch slapped across the saddle. They were the original instant messengers, risking their lives to ensure that a letter could cross the continent in 10 days instead of 3 months. They survived the night by trusting their horse's instincts and their own desperate need to keep moving. And finally, consider the letter under the floorboards. In times of war or occupation, the post office wasn't a place of safety, so people created their own. They survived the night by writing secret letters to loved ones, knowing they couldn't be sent yet. They'd hide them in walls, under floorboards, or inside hollowed-out books. These were the post offices of the heart. To write those words was a survival tactic, a way of keeping a part of yourself alive when everything else was being stripped away. They were messages sent to a future they weren't sure they would see. As we look at these lonely outposts and hidden messages, we see that humans will go to extraordinary lengths to stay in touch. We will climb mountains, sail oceans, and live with penguins just to ensure that a few words can travel from one heart to another. We survive the lonely night by remembering that someone is waiting to hear from us. The mailbag is closed now. The barrel in the Galapagos is empty. The penguins are quiet, and the postman has reached the mountain hut. You've sent your message to the world, and now it's time to receive yours. The night is safe, the world is connected, and it's finally time for you to let the ink dry. The delivery is complete. There are no more letters to write, no more miles to walk, and no more stories to tell. The stamps are all canceled, and the office is dark.
Chapter 24. The Evolution of the Great Sleep. Since you are still drifting in the quiet orbit of wakefulness, let's bring our journey full circle. We have traveled from the freezing, smoky huts of the Middle Ages to the neon-lit diners of the 70s, and from the lead-lined coffins of kings to the penguin-guarded mailboxes of the Antarctic. To conclude this marathon, let's look at the technologies of comfort, the things we've invented to ensure that when we finally do survive the night, we do so in the most blissful way possible. In the 14th century, a comfortable bed was a luxury so great it was often the most valuable item in a person's will. People didn't leave behind their houses, they left behind their great standing bed. To survive a night in a medieval bed was to be encased in a fortress of feathers. These beds were massive, curtained-off islands of warmth. The curtains weren't just for privacy, they were a primitive form of climate control, trapping your body heat and keeping out the damp drafts of a stone castle. If you were a king, your mattress was stuffed with swan down. If you were a peasant, you survived on a tick stuffed with straw or pea pods, which you had to fluff every night to move the lumps of dried vegetation around. Then came the rope bed of the 17th and 18th centuries. This is where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from. The mattress, usually a heavy sack of horsehair or wool, rested on a lattice of tightly woven ropes. Over time, the ropes would sag, and you'd end up sleeping in a human-shaped taco. To survive a night with a good night's rest, you had to use a bed wrench to tighten the ropes before you climbed in. It was a nightly ritual of tension and adjustment. You survived by staying tight and keeping your bugs, which lived in the wooden frames, at bay with a coating of arsenic or turpentine. Let's float into the Victorian era, the age of the iron bedstead. The Victorians were obsessed with hygiene, and they realized that wooden beds were essentially luxury apartment complexes for bedbugs, so they switched to iron. To survive a night in a Victorian bedroom was to sleep in a world of cold metal and heavy quilts. This was also the era of the bolster, that long sausage-shaped pillow that went underneath your actual pillows. It was believed that sleeping perfectly flat was dangerous for your digestion, so you survived the night propped up at a 45-degree angle, looking like a very comfortable casualty of the Industrial Revolution. In the 20th century, we moved into the era of the inner spring. In 1871, a man named Heinrich Westphal invented the coil spring mattress, but it took decades for people to trust it. Before that, a mattress was a passive thing. Suddenly, it was pushing back. To survive a night on an early spring mattress was to experience the strange sensation of buoyancy. We were no longer sinking into straw or wool. We were floating on a series of steel clouds. It changed our relationship with gravity. We survived the night by surrendering our weight to the machines, trusting that the springs wouldn't snap and turn our sleep into a very surprising trampoline session. And finally, we reached the modern night, the age of memory foam and weighted blankets. We have reached a point in history where we spend hundreds of dollars to simulate the feeling of being hugged by a warm marshmallow. We use sound machines to simulate the rain we used to fear, and we use blackout curtains to simulate the darkness we spent centuries trying to conquer with candles and oil. We survived the evolution of sleep by turning the bedroom into a sensory deprivation tank, a high-tech version of the enclosed anchorite cell, but with better thread counts. As we look at these beds, we see that the history of comfort is really the history of safety. We want to feel held, we want to feel warm, and we want to feel separate from the chaos of the world outside. Whether it's a straw tick in a cottage or a $2,000 smart mattress in a penthouse, the goal is the same: to find a place where the survival part of the night can stop and the resting part can begin. The ropes are tight, the feathers are fluffed, and the springs are silent. The curtains are drawn, the magic fingers have stopped vibrating, and the memory foam has molded itself to your exact shape. You have survived the entire history of the human night, from the first fire in a cave to the last blue light of a smartphone. You have made it. There are no more chapters. There are no more kings, no more hackers, and no more polar explorers. There is only the soft weight of your blanket and the slow, steady rhythm of the world turning in the dark. You are safe, you are warm, and you are finally, truly finished. Chapter 25, The Final Candle and the Quietest Hour. Since you've stayed with me until the 25th hour, let's look at the very last thing that happens before the world truly vanishes into sleep, the quiet hour. This isn't a place on a map or a piece of technology. It's that thin silver sliver of time, usually between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., when even the modern 24-hour world finally seems to hold its breath. In the Middle Ages, they called this the dead of night, but in our journey, let's call it the survivor's peace. In this final chapter, we see the ordinary person at their most honest. Whether it was a monk in the year 1100 blowing out a tallow candle, or a nurse in 2025 finally sitting down for a 3-minute break, this is the moment when the doing stops and the being begins. To survive this hour is to face the ultimate silence. There are no more stories to distract you, no more chores to occupy you, and no more history to learn. It is just you and the darkness.
But there is a beauty in this survival. Throughout all the centuries we've visited, this hour has been the same. It is the time of the night thinker. It's when the greatest poems were whispered into the dark, when the most daring escape plans were hatched, and when the most profound realizations about life were made. We survive the quiet hour by realizing that the dark isn't an enemy to be conquered, but a space to be filled with our own inner light. Think of the global lullaby. At this very second, while you are listening to these words, millions of people across the planet are doing exactly what you are doing. Somewhere in a high-rise in Tokyo, someone is watching the city lights flicker. In a village in the Andes, someone is pulling a wool blanket tighter. In a suburb in London, someone is listening to the rain on the roof. You are part of a massive, silent chorus of humans all navigating the same night. We have survived the wolves. We have survived the blackouts. We have survived the inbred kings and the frozen mines. We have moved through the sunken cities and the desert libraries. And now, at the end of the road, we find that the most important survival tool wasn't a sword or a heater or a lead-lined coffin. It was the simple, stubborn knowledge that we are not alone in the dark. The final candle is guttering now. The wick is charring, and the flame is a tiny blue-white point of light. The history of the world is folding itself up and tucking itself away under the bed. The ghosts of the Vikings, the hackers, the lighthouse keepers, and the Romanovs have all found their places in the shadows. They are resting, and so should you. There is nothing left to say. The air is still. The room is safe. The night has been survived. Good night.